You're listening to The Breakup Theory, conversations about ending things and collective liberation. Today I talk with the great writer and friend Megan Milks about their new essay collection Mega Milk, published this year by Feminist Press. Just have to say that Mega Milk by Megan Milks is maybe the best title and author combo that will ever exist. But beyond that amazingness, Megan's book contains many paths of exploration through milk, both literal and metaphorical, toward questions of names, transition, family history and dynamics, nourishment, connection, and human relationships with animals, agriculture, business, and land. The book is vulnerable, freaky, kinky, funny, and informative all at once. We get into all of this in the conversation. But as I say to Megan, I find the genre of the personal essay to be one of the most difficult types of writing to pull off well. You need to find something singular enough to make broad connection with an array of readers, and often the most successful type nestles such a memoir inside a tangential, impersonal narrative based in research and fact. With a book, there's typically a thematic line, like Milk, that is able to hold the essays together loosely without strangling them. The key is for the writer to open the essay up to all of the contingent possibilities while still maintaining a formal hand to guide the reader. It's not a genre I've delved much into in my own writing because I stop immediately at vulnerability. One of the most interesting things to me about the trans personal essay collection in particular is how it gets at transition askew. It's not a transition narrative from A to B like a classic kind, nor is it a realist stylization of trans experience like the kind of next wave of trans fiction. Where transition comes in this personal essay collection, it's in pieces, resisting linear time, often even incidental to the thoughts and feelings and research of the writer. And yet transness is somehow always there. I think it's an exciting place for trans literature to go, navigating out of the genre stereotypes that congeal every half decade or so. And Megan does a really amazing job. As with names, which Megan and I discussed, there's perhaps a kind of ambivalence towards the representation of transness. I bring up Ralph Ellison's essay in our conversation, Hidden Name, Complex Fate, which ruminates on his near namesake Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was Ralph Waldo Ellison. This places Ellison into a particular relationship to American literature, a burden of inheritance to take on, as he also aimed to escape the nightmare of history into invisibility. The name works retroactively, creating meaning where maybe there was none. This pertains to the trans narrative told retroactively, often with an attempt to make it seem fated from the beginning. Megan's name is not hidden, but they wrestle with its potential fatefulness, with transition coming in as a kind of freeing or loosening while still retaining that meaningful burden and not severing all those relationships. All right, I'm getting all lit crit on you. Perhaps this veers away from Megan's own thinking, so I'll let Megan talk for themselves in our conversation. But first, I can't recommend this book enough, so pick it up at your favorite bookstore. Mega Milk, Feminist Press. Megan has two other books with Feminist Press, the novel Margaret and the Mystery of the Missing Body, which I love so much because it plays with the kid detective genres of my childhood, and Slug, a collection of short stories. Get them all. Megan's also out on book tour. If you listen to this when it first comes out, you can still catch Megan in Chicago on April 10th, Women and Children First. Also May 14th in Decatur, Georgia at Charis Books as part of Sam Ace's Meet Me There series with Matilda Bernstein Sycamore, another beautiful writer. And June 11th in Boston at the Model Cafe Tea for Tea reading series. So if you're in any of those places, definitely go catch Megan. You can follow Megan on Instagram, sklimnegam, which is Megan Milks backwards. And there you can see that Megan offers workshops pretty often. You can learn about them and sign up for them. Megan is such an insightful writer and teacher, and I recommend you checking those out. Before we get into the conversation, I'll do my usual rundown of ways you can support this project. If you like the podcast, please rate it and follow it on the different apps where you listen to it. This helps boost the potential audience. Also, tell your friends. I love hearing from people about their thoughts, so write in. Any questions you want us to tackle or address or ruminate about, you can leave us a message at 917-426-6548 or use the form forum.jotform.com/thebreakuptheory/stories. That form is secure. Or you can find me on Instagram at The Breakup Theory and DM me. I'm also at Shuli Branson. If you want to access more of my work as well as the work of the wonderful Carla Joy Bergman, Danny Burleson, and Vicky Osterweil, sign up for our newsletter at cawshinythings.com. If you subscribe, you'll also get access to all of our articles, our Discord server where we have discussion, movie nights, writing workshops, and book clubs, and more. Our podcast, advice column, and zine and sticker library are always free. As I've said, I'm really proud of this collective that we are building because we are supporting each other as individual writers who typically get isolated into this impoverished work of writing. And through this collectivization, we find new ways to engage with other people who want to do collective thinking and writing. If you want to reach any of us there, you can email caw.shinythings@proton.me. And I'll be hosting a book club on our Discord server April 22nd at 5 p.m. Eastern on the anarcho-nihilist book Blessed is the Flame by Sarafinsky. Subscribe and join us whether or not you read the book, and I'd love to hear you at the conversation. The Breakup Theory is a member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, which pulls together a wide variety of shows taking an anarchist perspective on culture, politics, actions, and more. Check it out at channelzeronetwork.com. I'm really excited. I'm here with my friend, the great author Megan Milks, to discuss their new book, Mega Milk, that came out in January with Feminist Press. Megan's written a few other really amazing books, and I'll link to all of these in the show notes. But we're here, I think, mostly to focus on the current one, but we'll talk a little bit about the other ones too. Anyway, Megan, can you introduce yourself with any kind of pertinent information that you want to share at the top?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here on the show. I'm a big fan of the Breakup Theory as an idea and as a podcast series. Yeah, I don't think I have anything that I want to share at the top. My other books are Margaret and the Mystery of the Missing Body and Slug and Other Stories, and they're both on Feminist Press. My third book on Feminist Press. I love being part of that community.
Yeah, that was actually also a hind question for me about your relationship with them because they're such a cool press and you've dedicated your work with them so far. They put out so much cool stuff. And I highly recommend the other books. I really loved Margaret, particularly because from a nostalgic reason, because it plays with the genre of like the kid detective stories that I loved, like Encyclopedia Brown. And I thought that was just such an innovative form to use in the book. So another plug for that.
Thanks.
So Mega Milk, which is, such an amazing title for a book by Megan Milks, is a collection of personal essays. So it's not a novel, it's not short fiction. And I just wanted to start off just because I haven't written a collection of personal essays. From the outside, I feel like it's a really hard genre to work in because you have to balance all these things. Like you want enough of yourself in there to make it like compelling and to connect, but you have to have other aspects of it that are like broader than yourself. So I was wondering about your process and maybe even interest in writing personal essays and how that might have differed for you with the other genres that you've worked in.
Yeah, thanks for this question. Right. So yeah, I have mostly published fiction. I'm mostly known as a fiction writer, but I have published a good amount of nonfiction over the years, including critical essays and more personal writing. I used to co-edit and co-publish a zine where I kind of self-published some more longer, like hybrid personal critical essays there. And I've been teaching the essay for a really long time. And I would say I probably, even though in terms of like my academic training as a creative writer, I've been trained in fiction writing, and most of the workshops I've taken as a student writer, graduate student, more in fiction. I've been teaching essay writing, I think, more continuously over the years than I have been teaching fiction writing. So I think my interest in the essay, I'm such a promiscuous reader that I'm like sort of constantly reading in various genres. But I've also learned a lot about the essay as a tradition and a genre by teaching it. You were asking about Right, how to balance all these things.
Well, also, like, the difference between a standalone essay and then a collection of essays, I think, is significant too.
Yeah, I mean, I think with this project, I guess after I finished Margaret, my novel, and then I had, maybe like half a year of waiting before it was due to come out. I was tinkering around with a couple of essays then, and I took a workshop with Dodie Bellamy over the summer. Because it was, early pandemic, and she, lives in the Bay and has taught this summer workshop in her home for many years. And so that summer I lucked out and was able to take it online. And so that kind of gave me a boost and a push and like some encouraging feedback. Because for that workshop, I turned in the beginnings of what would eventually become like the essays Skim Milks and Muscle Milk. And I think even the muscle milk, oh no, I can't remember. I think the skim milk was originally not about milk at all. And then I was like, what if I was starting to think about a milk book? And then I was like, how could I turn this essay, which was originally just about this erotic romance novel that my grandmother gave me, but it had the word skim in it because I was talking about like learning to skim as a reader. Anyway, all to say is that new narrative has been really formative and influential. And working with Dodie kind of that summer, like really kind of revived that interest and influence in me. And then I'm also very influenced by, folks like Gloria Anzaldúa and Audre Lorde and, second wave queer feminists who were bringing together the personal and political during that period of, 80s and early 90s. So I don't know, new narrative and that kind of particular subgenre of feminist writing that's pretty hybrid. I think they were good models for essay writing that can be very fluid and expansive and draw on the personal, the political, and bringing in research and theory and things like that.
Yeah, I like that lineage better than like the Philip Lopate or like man heavy sort of serious personal essay tradition. But one of the things that you started saying like makes me think about the fact that you do end up with this organizing principle of milk. And I was curious to what extent that like preceded the essays. And it sounds like it kind of organically came up, organic milk. But also it seems like, and obviously you discussed this in the book, that you're like kind of fated to write this book, given your last name, Milks. It made me think of Ralph Ellison, who wrote Invisible Man. His middle name was Waldo, so he was like Ralph Waldo Ellison, and he had an essay called Hidden Name, Complex Fate, which I think might be applied to Mega Milk too, because you're ambivalent in some ways about the name. So maybe you could talk a little bit about when you kind of allowed yourself to let milk in and how then that came to influence the further writing or like the revision of previous work that you had done and, what new stuff it brought in.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that essay by Ralph Ellison, and I must read it, clearly. Let's see. I think I don't know. Like I can like go back and trace like this happened and this happened and this happened. And then I was thinking about all these things together. But I think I like needed a project that felt kind of low stakes because, I had these two books. I had Margaret and Slug, which were both coming out in the fall of 2021. And I just needed a new project. I had thought that my next book so Slug is a revised, updated version of my 2014 collection. So it wasn't like entirely new work. I had thought that after Margaret, I would return to short fiction, but instead I turned to the essay as a form. And then, yeah, let's see, when I lived in Chicago, I did this column for the Landline Quarterly called Name Tags. And it was a column about issues related to names and naming. And for many years, I had been obsessed with names and obsessed with the question of whether or not to change my name. This was like both before I came into a trans identity and then like more urgently when I did come into a trans identity. And I really loved the essay that I had written for that column. It was just like riffing off of my name. And when I was like poking around in my files to look at what I had started and just what projects I had in the works that I could maybe return to, that was something that I was like interested in maybe revisiting. And then all this stuff was going on in cultural discourse around milk. I remember when Get Out came out in 2017, it like really made me think freshly about milk and about like what the implications were potentially of being a white person with Milks as my last name. And it just kind of stuck with me and I wanted to explore it in writing. And so it did kind of like come together pretty organically. And then I ended up developing a proposal. I thought the book would be initially more about names and kind of like this quest to find a new name, which even as I'm saying this now, it sounds like such an awful, cringy project. I'm very glad it didn't go that way. But yeah, milk just became more and more interesting and took me in all these different directions. So I just followed the milk as the rivulet says it spread out.
I mean, there's so much cool stuff you do with milk metaphorically, but maybe before we get into that, thinking about the names, if you don't mind, like, I don't know, we've talked about this personally about like being trans and choosing a name or not, that as you transition, or like I know people who've changed their names multiple times over transition or in their lives. So you move from the idea of maybe working on names to working on your name, Megan Milks, and you clearly like I don't know, we've talked about this. I don't maybe not clearly. You chose not to change your name, right? So I wonder to what extent the writing of this book, which kind of solidifies you as Megan Milks, right? It would be hard to be like change your name now and then like republish this as like some under some other name and have it, I don't know, be like the best title ever. So yeah, I just wonder what your relationship to name as a trans person, how it may have changed through the writing of this book and your own inner discussions about names, because I found that difficult myself.
Yes. I still find it difficult and it's like an open question for me. And I think there's still certainly the possibility that I may eventually change my name. But for now, I have not done so. And I guess I should say that like there was a period, I guess in 2016, 2017, where I was trying out a few different names socially that just never stuck. And I was going by M for a while. And then there were a few other names I was trying out. And I think really for like, I'd say probably like 10 years, this question was like going on in the back of my head. Like, will I change my name? If I do, to what will I change it? What is the right name? How will I know? And it was a little bit, I was frustrated with myself because around me, like you, I know so many people who have gone through this process, some of them multiple times. And I've been so just kind of like awed and impressed by their ability to find the right perfect name, so much so that I can't imagine them being named anything else. But it just wasn't the case for me. And then with this project, like initially, I thought I would use the book and the writing of the book to kind of force myself into choosing a new name. And that just didn't happen. So I guess I was like not that invested in it. I became invested in other things. Yeah, I really thought like to bring in like the breakup theory. I thought that it would be like a breakup story,
Yeah.
breaking up with my name, but instead it became this sort of like, okay, an ambivalent recommitment.
So in a way, you did write the name book, but in this sort of sublimated way that, I think that there's something really cool and admirable about trans people who don't change their name. I mean, also, okay, so there's like changing your name as part of transition process that might include social transition and also potentially hormones or surgery. But there are plenty of people who, first of all, have a non-binary trans identity or even transition, like would consider themselves a woman or a man, but still hold on to a name that might be gendered or thought to be gendered differently. So I always think that's cool and interesting too, because, the fact of being able to transition shows the possibility of change. And then keeping that dissonance to me is actually inherent within the experience of transness. So I'm just saying, I think that's cool and I admire it. And the fact that your book it's dealing with transness, but not as its main topic. And the name becomes almost like a substitute for thinking about transness. And still, it's not completely like introspective, like, why is my name Megan Milks or whatever? It's an opportunity to go into all these other places. To make that into a question, I'm wondering what your thought is just as trans literature becomes a more historied genre. It's, been around as a self-conscious thing now for a few decades. And there's been various waves in what people are interested in. I see this interesting change now in trans people writing books that have the story of transition within them, but it's not the story that's being told. And I think your book does that, as I was saying. So I wonder what your thought is just about this book as a kind of entry into trans literature, if you even would want to consider it part of that.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. I'm sitting with what you were saying about how the book kind of uses the name as a substitute for transness or as a way to think about transness. That's really interesting. Let me return to this question about translit in a moment and go back to kind of what you were saying about the potential dissonance that can arise between a name and a gendered self or presentation. Yeah, I guess just to like add one thing to this, I think I presented a kind of agonized version of my name quest or questions. But I agree with what you were saying about like the thrill of that dissonance. That's something that has kept me really interested in holding on to my given name. And I also really appreciate the history that it attaches me to. Like, I've been publishing under this name, for 20 years now. So,
Yeah.
okay. And you were asking about Mega Milk as an entry into translit. I definitely do think of this as a work of trans literature, not just because I'm trans and I'm writing about myself.
So, reading this book, as I was saying, transition isn't the focus of the story, which, is the kind of traditional trans narrative, is like the story of how I transitioned. Typically in the past, it was told with a lot of violence and perhaps a bad outcome, or that was expected, like old gay literature too. Or maybe we haven't left that paradigm. And then people have sort of rethought the trans narrative in various ways, playing with realism, playing with speculative fiction, all these different things. But I see this book as a collection of personal essays, which may make you assume that it was going to be, a personal story of transness as you are a trans writer. And as we're saying, like, it has this reflection on a name, which is like has such a specific place within trans culture to think about names. I see the trans story kind of like askance in this book. Like, it's there. I guess you could piece it together in some kind of more linear chronological narrative if you wanted to. But for me, it's more interesting that it's like kind of floating at the edges. And while we could bring this kind of orbit between name and transition in the book to say that transition becomes the focus, I think that your really cool structure and the way that you use Milk to hang these essays together actually provides this unique way of placing trans into writing that frees up to do other stuff than stay linked to these other, generic tropes. So it's like moving, I see it as sort of moving into newer territory.
That's really interesting. And I think that's why, like, when I think back to like my initial project proposal, I feel so cringy about it because it would be doing a kind of transition narrative in a way that I think that's just not a book that I wanted to write. So I suppose my failure to come into a new name sort of saved me from this, like, more standard trans narrative. Not to say that like that kind of trans narrative is like bad or uninteresting, but that was not the arc that I lived through or experienced. And so, yeah, I think transness shows up in other ways. And I was really interested in thinking about like milk as like a trans or potentially trans substance.
Totally.
Yeah, because it like, it has so much transformative potential. It can become so many different things.
We've transitioned from like cow milk to oat milk, for example.
Yes. And I think there's maybe like, I don't know, I don't want to like overdo like the universalizing transness, but thinking about like transitioning from, one kind of relationship to family to another kind of relationship to family, or thinking about hormones as a kind of milk that can like create change and nourish us. Yeah.
Right. It can be a liquid substance too that you take into your body. And like you have the stuff about muscle milk too, like you were saying, the ways that milk comes into the advertising and cultural understanding of milk as part of like forming your body in a healthy way. Also, just like thinking about milk in relation to transness, like you're not just staying with milk in one place, right? Like you take milk literally to the extent that you like go to dairy farms and you spend time with cows and you think about like human lactation too. But it's also metaphorically, like you said, there's an essay called Skim Milk where you're talking about skimming reading, skimming, actually what the process of skimming milk is like, and how skimming could play a part in other aspects of your life. Or like the final sort of culminating essay, The Squeeze, has a lot of different iterations of what squeezing can do, again, ranging from the quite literal process of milking a cow to like, how do we hug each other? Right? There's like all these kinds of ways that you're able to open up through milk, and it gives you a kind of rich metaphorical terrain to work with. So I don't know. I mean, I don't want to belabor any kind of connection with transness, but so maybe you could just delve more into milk and how using that as an organizing principle instead of like limiting you to like try to make every essay come back to, and this is about milk, right? Like it actually opens up all these different places that you go. And maybe they were unexpected. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you so much for that reading. I think I was just kind of like constantly looking for new avenues, new ways of thinking, and sort of like letting myself be guided by the subject into wherever it wanted to take me. Also, it was really just kind of like following the research path,
Hmm.
the research trails. Milk is such a huge subject, really. It touches on so many areas of life, areas of experience. It touches on nutrition, the body, food consumption, mothering, nurturing, race, religion, histories of colonialism, politics. I mean, what doesn't it touch on?
Yeah.
And so I was really asking myself, like, which subjects within the subject are announcing themselves to me as like something that I could do something interesting with, whether it's like because of my relationship to the subject, like whether I had a personal connection to the subject, whether I had access to someone who had a personal connection to the subject, or whether I felt like as a writer I could do something interesting. So I was really kind of like using the personal and also like keeping an eye on craft and my own interests as a writer, using those elements to kind of contain these like different milk flows.
Yeah, that definitely comes across. And again, I think that's like part of what I'm curious about in writing personal essays because yeah, like you are in this book, right? You're the I, like the pronoun I who writes this book, and you have family history in here, and there's research that you present or reproduce in here, but also your research takes you into places, and we follow you going into these places that many of them are new and unknown to you, so we see through your eye that way too. The way that you figure in this book, it's like interesting that thinking about this as you were talking, it's like you're not always in the frame, you're sort of on the edges, and maybe this is like a writerly thing as like observing and also being at multiple levels at once, right? To like be experiencing something and thinking about what you can do with that experience. And like, I mean, you really play with forms. You're playful and also innovative with the forms, which is something I like. And I saw in Margaret before I had read this. Writing a personal essay is hard. I find it hard to write personally. People say that it's like way more compelling. And when I've done it, I've gotten really good response, but I find it really hard to be that vulnerable. So I'm wondering what your thought is in your kind of placement of yourself within this and how much you want to share and how much you kind of remove yourself as a writer.
Yeah, I think with some essays, the personal was much easier to access and bring in. With others, it was a kind of challenge. And I really benefited from early readers, from friends who were early readers who pushed me to like get more personal, get more vulnerable. There were a few essays that, I mean, at various points, I got so overwhelmed with the research and I wanted to bring, all of this amazing material that I was learning about. I wanted to bring all of it in. And I had to just kind of like keep going back to this, like using the personal as a constraint. And
That's interesting.
yeah, one book that I was holding in mind as a kind of guide in terms of vulnerability was Brian Blanchfield's Proxies, where he gives himself two restraints at the outset for each essay. Like one is no research, no outside research while he's writing each essay. And the other is that each essay has to break open into something personally vulnerable. I'm probably not getting that exactly right, but something to that effect.
Yeah. I don't remember exactly, but I love that book.
Me too. And so, yeah, I was holding that in mind for each essay. Like, how can I push this into a place where I'm being vulnerable? Because as a reader, I love intimacy. I love vulnerability. I love being brought into a writer's process, whether it's thinking through something or feeling through something. So I really wanted to give my readers that kind of experience with each essay.
Yeah, that actually makes it clearer to me. Like one of the compelling things about a good personal essay is the accompaniment of with the writer of working something out. It's not like you're like an academic paper or whatever. You're like presenting something that you've already figured out and you present it very clearly up front and then like demonstrate it. But in a personal essay or in these personal essays, you start with like a question or like a sticking point or perhaps something that came up in your research or a place that your research brought to you to like a farm, and then yeah, you don't have preconceived conclusions about what that's going to be. Like you let it bring you somewhere else, and perhaps that's unexpected. But then it's also playing with the vulnerability of yourself, so you might be also discovering things about yourself in the process that you didn't expect. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that speaks to you, like who you are on the other end of the book. We talked a little bit about your relationship to your name, but going through this as a kind of experimental, open, vulnerable process, if you feel changed by it in that way.
That's such an interesting, thought provoking question. Who am I on the other end of the book? I think I certainly know more than when I started off about milk. I know a lot more about milk. I've had a lot more experiences. I think on the other end of the book, I'm still pretty ambivalent about everything, names, about family, about the dairy industry. Yeah. So I'm ambivalent and still in a kind of not knowing place. I know more, but I don't have any major conclusions, which I think can be frustrating for some readers. And I totally understand that. So still ambivalent, still not knowing, but I have lived, lived more. I have taken myself to a manure expo and
Um,
among other things.
that's so amazing. The Manure Expo. I'm going to hold off on that. Just sticking with the openness that it takes to write a good personal essay. There's this scene, I think it's in The Squeeze, where you're getting physical therapy, and the woman who's giving you physical therapy, I don't remember her name, is asking you if the book is like against milk. And since you were talking about milk is a political issue, like, I'm vegan and there's various reasons for that. One is health. Like I can't eat milk without getting sick. But also, yeah, like the agricultural system is cruel and inhumane. You show that in many ways in the book. And someone might expect, like, if you're going to write a book about milk, it's taking some stance on milk. But that isn't what you're doing, right? And so you said that might be as frustrating to people, but I think there is something important to make an interesting book, a book that's not like, a political tract that allows for the space of these things to kind of butt up and clash with each other. Because you deal with these issues, you don't just like push them aside. So if you have more thoughts on that, just in terms of, I don't know if whether it's a question about this is what a good personal essay does, or the sort of where your research brought you, or just like the fact that you were this person holding all these experiences together where you had to take seriously like the people with whom you were engaging and give them respect, even if it was like, someone in a factory farm that you didn't really think was like a good thing.
Yeah. I mean, going back to what you were saying about something and what you just said about how I'm dealing with these things and not looking away, or do you remember what you said?
Yeah, you're not like refusing to touch the political sides of things.
Hmm.
You're just like, the point of the book isn't to make a political statement once and for all or come to a conclusion or give a solution, right? It's a place where we can hold the political, but you're holding it with all the pieces together and not forcing us to your conclusion at least, and you don't give one really at all, because you said you remain ambivalent in many ways at the
Hmm.
end of the book.
Yeah, yeah. I will admit that on the other side of the book, to go back to that question, I do wonder if I didn't go further with those sorts of political aspects. I think I look and I touch on these kind of uglier issues around factory farming, for example, food and dairy consumption. But I touch upon it and then I like pretty quickly flit away from it. And I have some questions for myself around that.
But like that has been talked about so much, right? And more interesting to me in the book is when you're dealing with, you're telling the story of this woman's family farm that she's struggling to keep alive. And you interrogate, you're like, I have this like nostalgic feeling and this sympathy for someone doing this. And that is something that we think about a lot, like the pushing out of the small farmers. And then that brings you though into this whole question about colonialism and how 99% of the small farms in the US are owned by white people, and how farms and homesteading were a major part of like conquering the land and stealing it from the indigenous people. So that was like really more interesting to me because I've thought about like the emissions from cows and the inhumanity and cruelty of slaughter and all these things. And like, we don't need to be eating all this beef. But yeah, I thought that tension was really interesting going into questions of property. That's not something that is like as expected when you're talking about milk.
Yeah, I was really just trying to approach all of this with genuine humility because I knew so little going in, and like the more I learned, the more I was aware of like how much more I could learn. It's just like there all of these issues are so entangled, and it's really hard ultimately to find moral grounding within it because there are so many actors and so many factors. And I was really trying to just like, maybe more so than like coming to conclusions, just trying to like document the thinking process, the research process, and getting a grip on everything I was learning about and being honest about everything I don't know.
Right. There's like a respect that you give the material, but also the people that you engage with, which I think like in this world, in like social media, politics world, we take a stance and then we call people out who don't like make it about one thing, which has a lot of limitations. Like, right, it like just excludes your engagement with other people, right? The curiosity that you can take with other people, the fact that there aren't black and white solutions to all these things, that like all these things are interconnected, like you say, and people's survival, and there's bad things and good things and all. So I think like that more complex and open space that you said is like humility. And I think also as a question of respect can actually complicate our political thinking more than, again, going with a preconceived notion of what you're trying to say. I operate a lot in like that political world where it's kind of boring just to like say the same thing over and over again, right? Whatever you're doing, whatever topic, it's like, well, communism is the answer, whatever.
Yeah, well, yeah, I appreciate that perspective. Yeah, one thing that was really, I think, important for me as I was writing this was just to keep in mind all of these different readers, imagining like my
Mm.
parents reading this, imagining the farmers who I talked to reading this, imagining people who are, more radically political and would be perhaps frustrated by the absence of a stance. And yeah, so I think holding those imaginary readers in mind was really important. And then also just being in writing groups with trusted friends and like my editor, Jean Thornton, like when I imagined Jean reading my work, I was like, oh, I can give Jean anything. And I know I will get like such good feedback that will be so constructive and generous and smart.
There's so much I want to talk about where we keep like skirting the issue and haven't really dug into it. But in terms of the vulnerability, there was a way that I was trying to connect this to what you just said, and I can't remember exactly, but I want to go here. So, in terms of the vulnerability of the personal essay, like, you know, a lot of the most vulnerable stuff in this is family stuff, right? Like the MAGA milk essay, which, talks about the use of milk as a symbol for like white nationalism, how there's a resurgence of that, is like working through your relationship with your brother and the kind of estrangement. And then you present so much of your relationship with your parents who you're not estranged from, but still there's like a distance that transness has created that you aren't trying to close necessarily. Like you want to keep your lives separate. Sort of at one point you talk about that, but this book is taking you into those places. So, we were talking a little bit before this discussion about how queer writers, might use their writing and literature and maybe form and structure to work through these family issues and like internal family phobias. And so I don't know, maybe you could talk a little bit about what it was like to dive into that, because that can be painful, and the process of writing it and like knowing that your family is going to be a potential reader of this.
Yeah, thanks for that question. One of the fantasies that motivated the book was that I might be able to like use the book and the writing in the book to come to some sense of like repair or healing with those kinds of like lingering hurts. For some reason, I really did not want to say wounds because it seemed like too much, but I think wounds is accurate too, lingering wounds. But yeah, like pretty quickly early in the writing, it became clear that that was not going to happen. I did bring in my parents into the writing process. Like I interviewed them multiple times and invited them to read and respond to drafts. And I mean, I think throughout that process, I was like communicating with them and like inviting them to communicate with me back. And they were willing to engage with me on that to some extent, but still didn't give me everything I wanted, which I have to accept, you know?
Yeah, that's part of, if you want to maintain a relationship with your parents, is accepting that you're not going to get what you want and that they're always going to be these limited people. That's actually something for me personally, like that I found interesting and helpful in reading about your relationship with your parents and family, is like, because we know so many queer and trans people who don't speak to their family, who have experienced really brutal violence from their family. And I have luckily haven't had that experience, but I also have an experience of like my parents not really knowing me. And so I think this is sort of what you talk about in the book. Like I maintain a relationship with my family that has some aspect of closeness and, love and connection. And yet there's like a limitation that isn't on one side their limitation, on one side my boundary, I think, in terms of, but it's not like the stereotypical, I was thrown out of the house or whatever. Like I'm lucky in all those ways. And I think you seem to occupy a similar place, which maybe is like also the ambivalence about names and stuff like that. Like, you have a connection with your family. It's not 100% terrible, but there are problems and limits and boundaries also. So I don't know. Maybe that's something you could also talk about, just because like you do have these separate lives that you do keep separate. And yet this book brings them up next to each other. Like you have an essay where you're like talking about a kinky scene you're doing and then also talking about your family, in the same few pages. And you shared some of this writing with them too.
Yeah. I mean, the whole time I was like so scared to do that work with them and to show them those sides of myself. But I also like really made myself do it. And I think, they see me perhaps more than I have given them credit for. They don't necessarily know how to engage with me, but I think they like see who I am. And yeah, now that they have encountered me on the page in this way, I don't know what they think.
There's that point in the Skim essay where you talk about how the effort you put into like producing a version to share with your parents that you felt would be okay for them. And then you like, I don't know if this is a spoiler, but you send them the previous version because you hadn't saved it. And so they read the full version and didn't freak out. But then you're like, maybe they just skimmed it. Which I think is funny because it's like all of these things about like oversharing or sharing, what are the limits, worrying about their feelings and taking care of their feelings. And then all of a sudden the answer is like, yeah, thumbs up. Or like your dad was like, I have this one correction to make. It's like, this is that person in the photos.
Yeah.
And so then you're like, oh, well, to what extent did they actually, it's not like the concern is no longer, could I hurt them with this? It's like, did they even read it? But yeah, I thought that was just so interesting too, because it shows a lot about, we internalize all this stuff. We also project all this stuff in our relationship with our family. And like you said, like they see you and maybe that's good enough. Like maybe you don't need to demand something more. And like what they give you is what they're able to give you.
Yeah, and I think like the essay that was the maybe the most challenging to write and also the most important for me to write was the one called The Letdown. And I think the use of that word as a metaphor, so the letdown referring to like the physiological response to like the infant's latch or the milk pump's latch that initiates the milk flow. But I think, it also means like disappointment. And so I think like that word was really useful as a metaphor to just think about like the mutual disappointment that we might experience within our families within this framework of nourishment. Like both can happen at once. But yeah, at various points I thought like, am I going too far with this, with calling my family out on certain things? Am I not going far enough? I just like was really kind of unsure and I tended to err on pulling back. But then I just recently read Jordy's new book, Night Night Fawn, Jordy Rosenberg. And yeah, the way that he is taking on transphobia in the family is like really, really bold and vengeful and really exhilarating to read for those of us who have experienced, well, I haven't experienced the level of transphobia that's represented in that book, but just very thrilling to read.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to force that subject or whatever. And like, there's a different kind of vulnerability. Like, I was going to bring up the letdown as an essay too, because I think the relationship that is most, I don't know if interrogated is the word, but like that concerns you, the family relationship that most concerns you in the book is really the relationship with your mother, because it's the most complex. And the letdown, one of the threads that holds it together is like discovering that your mom didn't nurse you as a child and like what your feelings are of that and how much can you use that to explain something, but you get into a different place with that. And there's something to say about the kind of remaining in that ambivalence rather than just to be like, oh, my mom was so shitty because she didn't do this thing, and or she like decided in advance to like me less or something. You end up in a more complex place than just this simple kind of solution in that essay. So it's interesting because you talk about the like contingency of the letdown being a term for lactating and then also disappointment. But I don't know that you end up fully let down in the end of that essay.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was talking to, when I was working on that essay, I was in a relationship with someone who is a therapist, and that person was really helpful to talk with about these issues as they were coming up. They kept reminding me that like these kinds of relationships, like you're staging these encounters like again and again and again over time. And sometimes like the encounters are different, like there are different feelings. And sometimes you feel really close and sometimes you feel really distant. And in the space of an essay, it's really kind of fake to create this arc of like going from, oh, we're going to have this like one conversation or two conversations and like really heal something, that's just not realistic. But in the work that I did for that essay, I talked with my mom 2 or 3 times, and then she also like read the draft and then emailed a response to the draft, which I ended up including in the final version. I felt like we came to a place of trust that was really important. And like not all of the things that could have and maybe should have been said were said, but that's okay. I mean, my mom had a stroke last year in the summer. So right now I'm just kind of like, I have very few expectations of her going forward.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
But I mean, in the time that we were working on this essay, just the fact that she was willing to engage with me, she was like open to me writing about our relationship. She was open to reading my writing about the relationship. And yeah, I felt like that was very loving. And I tried to bring a kind of loving approach to the essay.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like that is an act of love, searching for your origins through a name, or one of the tropes of trans literature. And one of the things like I think about when I'm trying to tell myself stories about myself, I'm like this is why, this is why I'm like this, or like this is when this happened, it set me on this course. Like you look for this kind of causal thing. But we've been talking about the structure of your book and the kind of voice and the explorations that you do, that they're not trying to set a point that explains everything. They're more interested in like opening up and leaving other room. So it makes sense to me that like, rather than to use an essay that starts with some disappointment of hearing family history and then like digging into that, you can end up with like, oh, there was an act of love that actually created later in life, right? That isn't necessarily like healing whatever wounds, but there's just a possibility that you might not have expected and certainly wouldn't be open to if you were just writing a vengeful book against your parents, trying to stamp out your queerness, even if it was unconsciously. There was something else I was thinking about, though, as you were talking, like about milk, too, and naturalness, because the milk gives you so much to work with, because on the one hand, milk is natural, right? It like comes from animals, not synthetic like soy milk or oat milk or whatever. And it's this like part of human reproduction and, mammalian reproduction, or you say even beyond that, kind of plays a role in our essentializing too, right? Like the mother's milk and all this stuff. Because the question of like, was I nursed by my mom is stuck within this whole politics of like breastfeeding, and really a more recent politics that says like true care for a child is through breastfeeding and not anything else, which doesn't take into consideration all kinds of people's bodies and lives and relationships. And so on the other hand, milk is unnatural to the extent that like we as humans grow up drinking, perhaps some of us, human milk, and then it becomes the milk of another animal, which is not like a common phenomenon, I think, in the natural world. And it's become like an ingrained part of our culture. So milk kind of also inhabits this like strange place between natural and unnatural, which I think you can do a lot with, and you do do a lot with in this book. Oh, and also you connect it with sperm, right? There's the bull semen.
Oh, yeah.
And then also you bring in the scene from Moby Dick where Ishmael's like squeezing the whale fat, the spermaceti, and he's like, it's like milk and sperm at the same time. So it's like all these like biofluids but also like unnatural connections and relationships spring forth from this
Yeah.
teat of milk.
That's so great. Yeah, it's all so queer, right?
Yeah.
It's like so fucking queer. And yet milk has this reputation for being like the most perfect, the most natural, the most wholesome substance, right? But yet, like when you actually look at all of the ways it's like coming to us, it's like really not that at all.
Yeah. Well, now I'm all politically, I'm like family abolition minded. I'm like, yeah, like the rethinking milk in our lives actually has something to do with the possibilities of like kind of untethering ourselves from some of these damaging or like enforced relationships of like family ties that can be good, mostly ambivalent, often bad. Just like when we denaturalize these kinds of things, be like, oh, like you can be fed from this other source, right?
Yeah.
Not your bio blood mother or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One other thing that keeps coming up, though, sort of on the edges of our conversation, and that I would like to hear about, because you're like a writing club person. Like you write in groups. I know this about you because I first met you through a friend who was in a writing group with you, and I witnessed your like Zoom book tour for Margaret. And you talk about your writing groups in the book. And you've also talked about sharing drafts with family and friends and individually and all these things. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your writing process, about that kind of communal aspect that counters the kind of solitude of writing, and how, I don't know, also the relationships and how relationships function when they're mediated through writing and revising like that.
Yeah, it's really important to me to be engaged in writing community. I have so much to say about writing groups. I kind of don't know where to start, but I feel like in writing groups that there's just like so much potential to really come to know each other so well and to trust each other. So there's like an intimacy in writing groups that I love. And I feel like I love bringing folks together whose work I admire and just being like, let's engage with each other in this way for a few months. And I just love getting to know people that way, especially people who maybe I only know through writing, and also people who I know more outside of their writing, and getting to know them through, you just like learn so much about a person. But yeah, like in terms of productivity and generating work, I find writing groups to be so useful to just like get me to want to write because I have these people in mind who I'm writing to and for and who I want to impress.
Hmm.
I want them to like enjoy the work and think that I'm smart and interesting. And so that's like a good way to like get me to bring my best self to the page.
It's another place of vulnerability. Like, I'm just thinking, if I was like thinking about sharing, I'm writing a book right now and I'm like, can't share it with anyone in this state, it's like, it would be embarrassing. But then, having a writing group gives you deadlines. Like you said, it gives you people to write towards who you want to impress. And it gives you like the feedback that's actually incredibly helpful as opposed to like writing in this like little vacuum by yourself. You have
Mhm.
to get over, I guess, that vulnerability of sharing things in an unfinished, quote unquote unfinished state. It's compelling to me, but I'm like, yeah, I'm getting all personal. I'm like, I shut things off before I even have the possibility. It sounds so good. Also, just like I admire the way that you participate in like kind of writing community, just for my own biographical information as I like came back to New York, you've helped me find employment and you've also like introduced me to other writers that I love and admire who I only knew before through their writing and I've got to see a different aspect of especially trans queer writing community that is really cool. So I admire the way that you participate in that because that's like also work, right? It's also I mean it's work not in terms of not like a job work, but it's hard to like be open and to many people and I don't know and feel maybe I'm just talking more about myself. I love going out and talking to people, but to get myself to be there, I'm like I need to feel like I belong there for some reason or people want to hear me be there with me. So I don't know. I think there's work that you put into relationships and relationships that matter. And it's not job work. It's different kind of work. I didn't mean to, yeah.
Well, I'm really happy that you're in Brooklyn and are down to hang out. So,
Well, yeah, there's that too. It's pretty sweet. Back to the book. One thing that I had written down that I wanted to talk about and we hadn't really gotten to is because we're talking about personal essay. It seems like it would be so much grounded in fact and family history and research on milk. And though you use all milk metaphorically too, it expands it. But you also like indulge in these kind of fantasies and also fantastical conceits in the book, like whether there's like kinky sexual fantasies, but also like you become manure at some point and invite us on a journey of like the processing of manure or the essay with the bull semen. I mean, there's a whole bunch, a whole bunch of kinky fantasy stuff going on in that. It feels so freeing to me as a reader to watch you go into that space. I wonder what your feelings and thoughts are about like including that in the book and how that opens up the essay for you.
right. Fantasy is just so pleasurable for me to lean into. And it took me a minute to kind of let myself do that with personal nonfiction. But once I did it, I was like, why am I not doing this in every essay? This is so fun. But yeah, I think of fantasy in nonfiction really as a workaround, like as a way to access things that you couldn't otherwise access. I guess it's similar to speculation, but I thinking more about it or like the kind of fantasy I'm engaging with in this book is really, really just sheer fantasy, right?
Yeah.
Like, let me imagine going on a road trip with the two other Megan
Oh
Milkses.
yeah.
If they're not gonna let me interview them, then fine. I'll just like make them characters and see what happens next.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like the key is just to make it very abundantly clear that it's fantasy, and I don't think there's any way to read these fantasy sequences like pretending to be factual or you know having actually happened.
Right, the merge into a mega milk. Um, but I mean, yeah, and also like with the bull, like I mean, I remember this in real life when you ordered the bull semen, and but then reading the essay about it, I'm like, yeah, like what do you do with that? Like, you have this container of bull semen, and there's all these possibilities, and they're mostly kinky um, to go into. So like, sort of, the essay in a way is thinking of it in my mind as like you kind of standing with this like container of bull semen being like, okay, like what the fuck do I do with it? And then you allow your mind to go into all these like freaky, kinky, interesting places while also informing the reader about the process of like studying bulls, which is something I think most of us probably haven't thought about very much. Um,
Yeah, and that was just like a kind of research surprise, right? I just kind of like stumbled into this genetic center and it's like, what is this? Yeah, yeah. But yeah, I was really interested in the idea of bringing together this like bull sire named King George with Lonesome George, who's an endling, right? And it's like, what might they have to say to each other? And it seems like they could do it through sex in some way. See if they're having sex.
oh, it's pretty amazing. Just like Lonesome George is like the end of his line, and a tortoise who they like tried to milk him into reproducing, and he finally attempted and couldn't. But for a long time, was just not interested in having sex with the quote unquote female tortoises or whatever. So yeah, that is a whole other fantasy in the book. That's really cool. Interestingly, I read this news article the other day that was talking about tortoises in some colony where the male tortoises are so aggressive that the female tortoises are throwing themselves off of cliffs rather than mate with them. Which I was like,
No.
it's like the opposite of Lonesome George. Yeah, it's
Another
a
kind of asexual resistance.
yeah. Throw yourself off the cliff. I was wondering though, so this is maybe a little more lighthearted, but like, through your writing of this, and you talk about this in the book, like your friends are just like sending you milk stuff. Like you become this magnet for anything milk that anyone who knows you're writing the book sees like, you have a fantasy of like giving a lot of that shit away at the end of the book, but I mean, are you gonna miss that? Is it still continuing to this day? That like, are you gonna like? I don't know. Yeah, will you miss people sort of supplying you with like
Well,
milk?
so far it hasn't stopped. I mean, the milk paraphernalia keeps coming, and I love it. Please don't stop. And I'm definitely not getting rid of any of it. I mean, it's so meaningful to me. But in the end of the book, I was sort of like, what would I give as party favors? And if I had this like fantasy party, and well, I have enough milk, milk items that I could use those.
Yeah, you could share. I was not to toot my own horn, but I was like, oh, I reading this as like, I think I gave you the Billy Bragg song, "The Milkman of Human Kindness," which you cite in the book in one kind of moment where you're talking about milk songs. I think on the
Indeed,
road
you
on the road
did.
trip.
Yes, yeah. Yes,
I
use
was like,
that.
yes. Yeah, it's a good song. Well, we talked about a lot of stuff, and I just want to know if there's more that you want to bring up, because we didn't talk about everything, nor even everything that we talked about talking about. But yeah, is there stuff that you feel like we haven't sufficiently dived into, or anything that you want to talk about?
No, I don't think so. I mean, this was really such a rich, fun, thought-provoking conversation.
I was looking forward to this. Also, I know you're on. I'm gonna try to get this out as soon as possible, and you're doing book tour, so I'll try to link to whatever upcoming events are when this comes out. But do you know where you're going next? I mean, I feel like it might be hard to follow this up. Or also, there's this weird place where you finish something, and you're like, I don't know what to do next. But do you have a sense of where you might be going next, writing wise?
Oh, I'm working on a new novel
Cool.
project. It's at the very early stages, so I'm reluctant to say much
Yeah.
about it. But yeah, I'm getting into it.
Cool. Yeah, there's also like putting something to bed is freeing for other thoughts, I guess.
Yes.
But cool. Well, yeah, thank you for giving me so much time. And everyone should read Mega Milks plus the other books that Megan has written. And you can get all of them through Feminist Press. So, yeah, thank you again for coming. And I'll see you IRL, I guess.
Thank you so much, Julie. This is fantastic.
You've been listening to The Breakup Theory. Rate us, follow us, and tell your exes.